Okay, welcome. Today I'm interviewing Sheryl, the author of The Wisdom of Anxiety. My name is Sheleana from Rising Woman, and Sheryl, I'd just really like to welcome you to this call. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk about your book and also to hear about your perspective on anxiety. So,
Mm.
why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to bring this work to the world?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. So, gosh, that's a big question. Um, I've always been on this path of psychology and inward awareness and self-reflection. Both my parents are therapists, actually, so it's literally in my blood, in my upbringing. I went to graduate school at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. I graduated there in 1997, and that has a Jungian focus. So the focus is on depth psychology, which is really everything underneath the surface, what we don't necessarily see or are aware of consciously, and it comes out through the unconscious. So it takes the approach that all of our symptoms, including anxiety, is our messengers. And if we deny them and eradicate them too quickly and have the intention of wanting to get rid of them, which is really understandable because anxiety is incredibly uncomfortable, we miss the message and it will come out in some other way. So our worry, our intrusive thoughts, our somatic symptoms, all of the myriad ways that anxiety manifests are messengers, letting us know that something is awry inside, that there is pain, there is wound, there are beliefs, there are cognitive distortions. There are all different messages. It's not formulaic. It's about recognizing I need to turn some attention inward. Anxiety is the distress flare, and becoming curious about what the messages may be.
Mhm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And Heather and I, with Rising Woman, we take a very similar approach. We've done a lot of shadow work and Jungian depth psychology, things like that. And I feel that that's something that our culture has sort of moved away from, and it's created a lot of um, disease in our bodies and in our minds because we've really been programmed to think that certain emotions are good and certain emotions are bad, haven't we? And
Yes.
what I love about your book is that you're really helping bring people back to the wisdom in what they're feeling. So I think I highlighted something here. It was the two cultural messages that create anxiety. This is on page 35 of your book. You said the myth of normal and the expectation of happiness. And I'd love you to just speak on that for a moment.
So the myth of normal, we have this idea that there is a box that we are supposed to fit in, and we are typically raised with in a belief in a cultural system that tells us that if we are outside that box, that there's something wrong with us. And basically, um, if you are highly sensitive, and I believe that we are all sensitive, some fit into the temperamental category of highly sensitive, but we are all sensitive beings. We have this incredibly sensitive heart. And so when we're raised with this message that our emotions are too much, too big, get over it, what's wrong with you, you're too sensitive, and we hear this, we hear it all around us, in family, with peers, in religious environments, in school, we are inundated with this message of there's something wrong with me. And so from that shame-based mindset, it is a very short hop into anxiety. If I believe there's something wrong with me, I'm going to feel anxious, right? And likewise, the expectation of unilateral happiness is insane. Like nobody is happy all the time. We are human beings, which means we experience the full spectrum of human emotions: jealousy, anger, disappointment, frustration, loneliness. We are wired to experience all of them, and we all will experience all of them. We will all struggle. We will all go through hard times. We will all go through dark times. We will all experience loss. And we will all experience joy and contentment and fulfillment and health and all of those wonderful things as well. But if we have this expectation that it is supposed to be a certain way, we are supposed to only be feeling happy, then when the more difficult feelings come in, we think, what's wrong? I must be doing something wrong. Maybe I'm in the wrong relationship. Maybe there's something out there that is wrong. And if I can figure out what that is, or something wrong with me and I have to fix it, then I will be happy and I will fit inside the box and I will fit in the norm. So much of my work is about exploding that box and exploding these myths. We have so many, those are just two of the myths. We have so many myths that create so much anxiety, and it's so unnecessary. It's like, why are we raising our young people and all of us in this cultural climate of these unrealistic expectations that can only lead to shame and anxiety?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of that now, and there always has been. One thing that I'm seeing now is that it's just a different type. Like we used to have the, you get married and you have children and you buy the house and you have the, perfect picket fence life. And it's interesting, the younger generation, we look at that and we go, oh wow, it's not like that anymore. But there's a whole new set of ways that we should be, right? It's like we should all be self-employed Instagram stars, and we should all, have the perfect everything. We should all look good all of the time and be happy and be popular, and be in a goals relationship, and everything really is cookie cutter in the same ways that it's always been. We just find new ways to reinvent the norm, and it's quite toxic in a way because it really takes us away from that innate path that we have, right? To follow what is true for us and to really feel like, my path doesn't look like the person down the road, and that's beautiful. Instead, we're saying, my path doesn't look like that. What's wrong with me? So, my question for you is, when I talk to a lot of people who I experience as kind of anxious, sometimes they'll have a hard time even saying that they're anxious. Or a lot
Mm.
of times when I'm feeling anxiety, I won't actually identify it as anxiety until I really tune in and go, okay, oh wow, what I'm actually feeling is anxiety here.
Mhm.
So we often relate that to sort of like a mask of feelings underneath. But what do
Mhm.
you think are some of the ways that people can learn to identify whether they're feeling anxious or not?
Yes, great question. Um, so, at the very heart of inner work is having some kind of practice that brings you into relationship with self and self reflection. If we are going and going and going and going all day and trying to hit the marks and trying to fit into the box and trying to contort ourselves on a daily basis and a yearly basis and in general into that cultural framework of should, and we're never stopping to self reflect, um, it's really difficult to identify anything that we're feeling, whether it's anxiety or anything else. So I am a big fan of having regular checkpoints throughout the day, like we would with a child. So the analogy I often give is, if you spent 10, because I'll have a client say, well, I spent 10 minutes journaling at night. And I'm like, that's great. That's better than 0 minutes. And if you had a child and you spent 10 minutes checking in with that child and being fully present just for those 10 minutes out of a 24-hour day, that child would not feel very seen or loved or connected to. It's simply not enough time. So we live in this culture that is all about staying busy, achieving, checking off the boxes of the forever endless to-do list, getting online. And of course, screens are the most colossal distraction that we are all dealing with right now, and can separate us faster than anything else from our soul, from our heart, from those interior worlds that need attention. Antidote is creating a regular practice. Morning and night are my preferences. Those are the liminal times when we are more vulnerable. We are between sleep and wake. We are going into sleep. Our defenses are softer. We have more access to those softer, more vulnerable realms. And to just check in. What am I feeling? Is there anxiety? Most likely there's going to be a strain of anxiety, because it's almost part of being human at this point. And especially if you are highly sensitive, we are wired for anxiety. We are wired to scan the horizon looking for danger. Part of what has kept our species alive is this trait that is hypervigilant. The challenge now is to learn to take that hypervigilant trait and channel it in a more productive way, so that we're not always looking and scanning for what's wrong. So the checkpoints are really important, not easy to do at all. again, in the culture that's encouraging us to just keep going, go, 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 go. And then to be able to know how it manifests. That's why I have a long list in the book of thought manifestations, physical manifestations, somatic manifestations. What does anxiety sound like? We're not trained in the language of anxiety because there is still a stigma attached to it, that we just don't talk about it fluently in the culture, that we don't know that anxiety is really a code word for worry. So when I have a client and I say, has anxiety always been with you? And they're like, no, I mean, I worried a lot when I was a kid. I'm like, well, that's anxiety, right? So worry is anxiety. Checking and scanning is anxiety. So many physical manifestations, digestive issues, not always, but can be anxiety, headaches, insomnia, right? There's I don't know, hundreds of ways that anxiety manifests. And if we don't know that, then it's much more difficult to name it as anxiety, because then we just think, oh, my stomach hurts. Maybe I ate something bad. And maybe you did, but maybe it's anxiety.
Yeah, it really can manifest in the body. And I appreciate in that, because I feel that that is something that a lot of us don't pay attention to, like when our bodies are acting out or our bodies are in pain, our digestive system isn't working properly. We're now just starting to understand how linked we are with, our minds and our bodies, and that trauma and all of these past hurts can really be stored in our bodies. And so I believe that when our bodies are crying out in that way, they're really saying, please listen to me, please pay attention to me, please give me what I need in order to feel safe. And so anxiety is very much like, in my reality, it's very much an alarm bell. It's like, please pay attention,
Yeah,
something needs to be addressed. Right.
that's right.
Mhm.
Exactly. And that's how I talk about it in the book, that it's a distress flare, it's an alarm bell, it's our internal system working correctly, as opposed to the mindset and the culture that says anxiety is evidence of disorder. When we call it a disorder, you have an anxiety disorder, right? And I understand, right, in certain situations it's helpful to label and diagnose, but we have to widen that out to say it is also evidence of order. It is evidence of an internal communication system working beautifully, brilliantly. It is our inner self, it is the unconscious saying, pay attention, tend, listen, slow down. There are clues here. And we have this incredibly wise guiding force inside that is guiding us towards wholeness and healing. I hear a lot of people often say, but anxiety is torturing me. There's nothing, there's no gift here, there's no wisdom here. Yes, it's incredibly uncomfortable. I know it well. I know it in my own being. I know it from raising my sons. I know it from my 20 years of working with clients. There's nothing fun about anxiety. And so it's not to paint it in this mystical, glorified light. We don't want to idealize it, but we want to recognize that the unconscious is always guiding us towards wholeness, towards healing. It is our ally. It is not against us.
Yeah.
So when these symptoms come out, they are acting on our own behalf if we meet them from that mindset.
Mhm. Yeah, beautifully said. And something else that comes to my mind really is around hormones, and especially female hormones. I've had my own fair share of imbalances just due to having such a stressful early life. I've never really had balanced cortisol and balanced progesterone, and I've worked with a lot of women and been friends with a lot of women who have had severe anxiety due to hormonal imbalances. And even then, I see what you're saying, and with anxiety is being wise in that it's notifying you that something is out of balance, and it
Yes.
can actually be pointing to something that needs resolution through the material world, or through the plant world, or even maybe sometimes the pharmaceutical world. And isn't it beautiful that your body is letting you know? And so can
Yes.
we thank our bodies when we're having that experience, even though it is torture?
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly. It's not always something is awry in my thoughts or something is awry in my feelings. Sometimes something is awry in my physiology. Of course, it's all connected. We know we like, it's easy to talk about it in these different quadrants, but we are all one system. But yes, anxiety is the arrow pointing you in the direction of some imbalance.
Mhm.
It could absolutely be, I need to go work with a naturopath, which I often tell my clients. I've never worked with a naturopath. It can be life changing,
Mhm.
right? To start to correct and start to get into more alignment with how our bodies are meant to be functioning.
Absolutely. Well, and it all does tie in, right? Because so when I was in my mid 20s, I was early 20s, I got married and then I got divorced. And it's a big part of my journey. But in that, all of my wounds were triggered. So deep, deep abandonment wound from childhood, deep mother wound that I had not addressed.
Mm,
And I gained about 20 pounds in a month. I
mm,
went and did all of these hormone panels because I had studied hormones for a lot of my life already. So I knew to,
mhm.
fortunately. And the only hormone that I had in my body was cortisol, and everything else had flatlined. I had nothing. And
Wow.
so it was really interesting to see how, my emotional state had triggered a complete shutdown. Like my thyroid wasn't working, my estrogen and progesterone had just gone to the bottom. And the only thing I had was this high level of stress in my body.
Mm,
And so, in that, of course, it was emotional. And about a year and a half later, all of the weight just fell off
mm,
and my hormones, started to shift. And I hadn't really done anything other than focus on self-love and focus on self-care and
mm.
healing. And so I think that that's something that we sort of neglect at times, where we have this physical issue and yet we don't slow down to say, what emotional root here needs to be nurtured. So I
Yes.
love that you cover a lot of that in your book. And I'm wondering if you want to just maybe talk a little bit about ways to communicate with ourselves when we're in that state, and then how to self nurture.
Mm. So, the practice that I teach mostly is a journaling practice, and it's a journaling practice that is not just a free form journaling. It's a dialogue between all of our inner characters. Very much comes from the Jungian mindset that we have multiple characters inside of us. We all do. That may be running the show at different times in our lives: a perfectionist, a critic, a judgment, a child. And then we have this inner parent that ideally is sitting at the head of the table. And so, in the journaling, in the dialogue, we start with the inner parent and we begin to have a relationship to all of these different parts of ourselves and becoming curious about. And I talk a lot about curiosity in the book as one of the guiding lights, one of the allies, and compassion of growing, which is not easy for a lot of people to shift from that mindset of what's wrong, get rid of it, to a mindset of curiosity and compassion, which immediately shifts the intention from one of get away to one of come toward. And, teachers like Pema Chodron and Brené Brown and all these amazing women have been talking for years about that shift in mindset that allows us to lean in, to move toward, to soften the heart um, towards these difficult places. Our instinct biologically is to push away pain. That biological instinct is entrenched by a culture that teaches us to push away pain. And so we have all of these beliefs that say it's not safe to feel my pain. So when I'm working with people who are having a hard time accessing the emotional pain, I start at the level of belief. What beliefs are you carrying about pain? Pain is weak, pain is get over, all the messages I heard, get over it, you're too sensitive, all of that. It's not safe, I'm going to be overwhelmed. Of course, as a tiny person, the enormity of an emotional experience, of a big emotional experience, is too much in a little body without big arms holding them, guiding them through it. And so we learn to disconnect. We learn to dissociate. We learn to go up into our heads because it's much safer and much more predictable up here. And this is where people often find me, is in the realm of the spinning of an intrusive thought. I can't get out of this mind trap of the hamster wheel of an intrusive thought. What if I'm with the wrong person? What if I have cancer? So it can be around relationships or around health or around money or around parenting. And they constellate where it matters most: around our kids, around our health, around our relationships, where the heart is involved. That's where the intrusive thoughts constellate. And so we learn to go up into that very safe relatively safe headspace. Anxiety then comes later in life, intrusive thoughts to guide us back in. So the journaling is one of my favorite practices for developing that relationship of kindness between the inner parent and the scared child or whoever is needing the attention in that moment. Um, Obviously, I'm also a big fan of therapy with the right therapist, because this is deep work. This is excavating deep pain. And when the rupture is relational, when you develop the belief it's not safe to feel my pain because it wasn't safe, the repair is relational. And and this is all your work is about conscious relationships. So yes, with our partners, but sometimes we need somebody else, right? We need that skilled, objective, loving therapist who can provide that safe space that we didn't have in those growing up years to thaw out the frozen emotional passageways. And it's the area that I see people are most afraid of, is feeling their feelings. We talk so much about changing our beliefs and our mindset. We talk about the physical realm, and it's all important. I talk about the 4 realms of self in the book: physical, emotional, spiritual, and cognitive. We can talk really easily about spirit. We can talk about our thoughts. We can talk about the physical realm and hormones, and it's all critically important. We have a really hard time not just talking about, but feeling our feelings. And that's where the trauma is. That's where the frozen response, that's where we shut down, and that's where the healing is. And that's one of anxiety's greatest messengers, is to say, it's time to thaw out and open up the heart.
And how hard it can be when we've spent our whole life defending against our feelings.
So hard.
Denying them. Denial is my favorite coping mechanism, I always say. I'm very good at it. In fact, I could probably teach a class. I definitely could. And it's been something that I've always had to work with big time when I went through my own personal awakening to my own wounding and my own healing journey. But even still now, I can still catch myself just sort of denying and just trying to push through. And I'm, whoa, like, let's be with this for a moment. That actually does hurt, or that actually doesn't feel okay. And so many of us learned that because, as you say, it wasn't safe, or we didn't have a space holder, or our caretaker was relying on us for some sort of caretaking. That was my history and upbringing. So I never really learned how to receive support and care. I only learned how to be strong.
Yes.
Many of us can relate to that. And so this really is the process of just learning how to feel your emotions while also trusting that it's safe.
Yes.
Because when we feel something that we haven't felt in a really long time, we might actually get so much anxiety because we want to run from it, we want to leave our bodies, or we think we might even primally believe that it could kill us.
Yes.
Right? So there's this other primal aspect of, oh my gosh, this isn't okay. Like, this is too much feeling. What's going to happen to me if I go into this? Will I ever come back?
That's right. And those are the 2 biggest fears about going into the feeling of, I'm going to die, or I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to lose my mind. I'll never come back. It will overwhelm me in some way. And I think that comes from that child, very young, often pre-verbal, of being left in the crib to cry alone, of being left until the point where you dissociate, because that's what a baby will do eventually. And then all of the countless hundreds of experiences of having that huge emotion coursing through at the tidal wave. I watch it in my sons, not so much now, they're older, but still now, when it really hits, it's because it's still so big, and they have grown up in an environment where they're safe to feel it. And so when it comes, it's big. And the only response from the parent, my husband or I, is to just hold them through it. Right? I'm here. You're safe. It's okay. And certainly when they were little, I mean, the emotions are big, right? They are big, and they can be so scary, and we do want to get away from them, and we want to blame or deny or freeze, or all of the ways that we try to get away from how vulnerable it is to just feel it. And if we didn't have somebody with us, we don't stand a chance. I mean, the only way to survive childhood then is to shut down.
Yeah. Mhm.
And it's a brilliant survival mechanism. It gets us through.
It does. Yeah. And then it sort of relates a bit to the attachment styles, doesn't it? So we either have these avoidants who really their safety was to not feel and to remove. And then the anxious person is just still kind of locked in that state of panic of I'm going
Mhm.
to be left or I'm not loved. And I really try to emphasize when we talk about the avoidant attachment style that really it is still anxiety. It's just anxiety that's been dissociated from. And
Yes.
so we have to learn how to empathize with that too, because there's a lot of shame and blame that goes on with, the attachment styles are just all the rage these days. They're so
Yeah.
popular. But there's like all of this stuff about how really bad and terrible avoidant people are and how we just need to
Mhm.
get away from them. And 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 so I think that we can really bring compassion to what that experience must be like too, and see the ways that that's the inner child really trying to cope, right?
Yes, and I don't think that this is talked about much when we're talking about attachment styles, but we can also change our attachment style based on who we're with. So it's not fixed in stone. I think that there's an element of it that's kind of like temperament. It's what we are more likely to gravitate towards. But if you're with someone who's fully available, and this is what I see all the time in my work with relationship anxiety, or let's start in the other scenario, you're with someone who has one foot out the door. You are the pursuer and they're the distancer, right? You're going to then name that as the avoidant. Oh, they're avoidant. I'm more anxious. I'm trying to pursue. Then you meet someone who turns around and faces you and they are right here fully available.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh, they're secure. Now I'm like,
Mhm.
what is this? I'm going to appear as the more avoidant because I think we all have strengths. And I
Absolutely.
think you're right. The avoidant gets a very, very bad rap in the culture these days.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do watch what you're speaking of. I've actually watched a friend recently who was always anxious and their partner was always avoidant. And then they got together and then they switched roles.
Yes.
And I said to them, what a beautiful opportunity to see what it's like to date yourself,
Yeah.
that opposite experience, so that maybe the next time you're in a relationship, or if you choose to remain in this one, that maybe you'll lean in a little bit differently this time because you have more compassion for what it's like to be on the receiving end.
Absolutely.
But we definitely do dance in that polarity, and I find myself, I watch myself flipping, and my husband is mostly secure, and then when we get into our silly little conflict dance, sometimes we do the anxious avoidant thing. And it's just interesting that we love to pathologize so much,
Hmm.
like you say, put ourselves in these boxes. And I agree that we can shift it, and that's again another powerful message, is that whatever we're dealing with is not locked in stone.
It's not. And that's the damage of attaching too strongly to something like I have anxiety, right? Or I am an anxious, I have anxiety disorder. And we're suddenly locked in to this diagnosis. When anxiety is something that is so workable and, you know, in some sense, just part of who we are
Yeah.
and this wise messenger. And so can we work with it in a way where it doesn't pull us under so much? Absolutely. But if we are attached to the diagnosis, it actually makes it more difficult for some people, not for everybody. For some people, they feel very contained by the diagnosis. And suddenly they say, oh, this is this thing. And it's not me, it's the diagnosis. And they are able to find more spaciousness around it. And that's great. For a lot of people, it's a label, it's a sentence. This is who I am for life. And that's not how it is.
Mhm. Yeah, and in the moment when someone's feeling really anxious, I've experienced this by having a friend who was extremely anxious, just really struggling with some of the most severe anxiety. It's
Mm,
menstrual dysphoria.
yes.
In those moments, let's speak to that for a moment, where people are having such a deep experience of anxiety that it's almost impossible to separate from those thoughts or those feelings, where it's
Yeah.
consuming, and we really believe what's happening as
True.
reality. Yeah, as true.
Well, to me, that is almost the definition of anxiety. I think it can go on for longer periods of time. And then it becomes, I don't know, it becomes more alarming for the person who's experiencing it. But that is anxiety, right? It's that acronym for fear, false evidence appearing real. When we're in it, it is so convincing and compelling,
Mhm.
right? That it's difficult to step out and say, maybe this isn't true. It comes in for me more now around health anxiety. I don't struggle with relationships, but especially around my kids. If something comes up and my mind wants to attach immediately, it could be the smallest thing. The other day, my son said, I have this little bump in my lip. And my anxious mind goes, oh, cancer, you know,
Mhm.
just like automatic. And I have to zoom out and then feel his lip. And then my inner parent comes in, my voice of wisdom. It's like, really unlikely that that's cancer.
Mhm.
We can get it checked out next time we go. And so it's also growing that voice of calm and that voice of reassurance, which so many of us did not have growing up. And so it's these are all muscles that we're all growing, that we're all working with, we're all practicing because we didn't get it in those early years. I think more kids are getting it now because there's such an explosion of consciousness around emotional intelligence and attunement and positive parenting and meeting the emotional. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's incredible, life-changing, globe-changing to see. Um, but everyone in the earlier generations didn't get it. And so it's growing that voice, and then it's being able to separate out in that moment to respond to the anxiety of feels so real and to say, what else could it be? It's
Mhm.
one of the cut through questions that I love for my clients with health anxiety. What else could it be? Just to create that little distance of witness, of mindfulness, where you are defusing from that instant fusion response, that
Mhm.
anxiety and fear. It's almost a habit, just to fuse, go to worst case catastrophic, and then to breathe and backtrack back and say, what else could it be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful question to ask. And
Mm.
it is really that time that we take to just take a few breaths and slow down and recognize, okay, I'm having one of those moments, I'm catastrophizing or whatever it is that I do in the moment, I'm dissociating. Can I come back? Can I ask a little bit more about what this really is? What am I really experiencing right now? What's really true here? Um,
Yes.
I think that that's a very important distinction. And sometimes when I'm working with our group members, and we have a program called Heal Your Relationships, and we run 8-week coaching groups. And a lot of times I get the question in the moment when I'm so triggered, how do I remember to actually step back and do that? Because I just, I fly off the handle or I do my coping mechanism. And of course it just takes practice. It takes a lot of practice, and it's not something that even I always get right. Like I would say maybe 20% of the time, and that's a great percentage, I think, for all of us. Like,
For sure.
we're not aiming for perfection here.
No, no. And I love that. And none of us are able to unhook in that moment. I think that is incredibly difficult to do. When you're hooked, you're hooked. That's the definition of a hook. You're triggered. And so maybe in 5 minutes, maybe in an hour, maybe the next day, you're able to step back enough to unhook and examine and say, what was really going on there? And of course, the depth of the trigger, right? A smaller trigger, like I was able to say, okay, it's really probably not cancer. Even though my anxious mind wanted to be really convincing, but if it's something with my husband and it's going into that deepest place of trigger and wound around a relationship that means everything, it's a lot harder to
Mhm.
step back. And it tends to take more time to step back and say, wow, I just got sucked into that vortex of whatever projection I was in that was convincing me that he was this, this, and that, and all my blame stories. And so, yes, like having patience and compassion with ourselves and knowing that it is really difficult. The expectation that you are going to unhook quickly is a really high expectation.
Mhm.
Um, that said, I think that there are practices like, of course, mindfulness and meditation and anything that helps us to slow down and grow that witness is going to help us perhaps shorten that time
Yeah.
between trigger and response.
And practicing it when we're not in the state of trigger, right?
Mm.
doing some of these journal activities that you mentioned and doing the body scans that you talk about in your book, taking
Mhm.
that time really to tune in on a daily basis really does train us to become more present even when we're triggered. And that doesn't mean that we're going to turn the feeling off. That's the thing we have to remember. If
Yeah.
we're stopping to tune in, it doesn't mean that you're going to say, what is this really about? And then all of a sudden you're going to feel better.
Mhm.
Might mean that you have that split second where you can choose to project or say something mean or do whatever it is that you would normally do, and perhaps just calm your system a little bit to go and do something else, like scream into a pillow or cry or to self-soothe or even to just say, I need a hug. um, and
Yes.
that would be
Beautiful. Yes. Yes. And um, that split second of having that choice point of I can say something mean right now, or I can attack, or I can accuse, or I can zip my lip and breathe and step outside, or just redirect, just focus on something else and get out of that charge of that moment. That is gold,
Mhm.
right? Just and having that experience once is what allows you to then build. And I was a very reactive person when my husband and I first met, and I react, and so was he. React, 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 accuse, accuse, attack, attack, attack. And it took a long time, years and years and years, decades of learning that that only makes things worse. Right? If it's so compelling in the moment, you just want to like get it out of my body. But it always makes it worse, right? And what it feels like to hold, as uncomfortable as it is, to just hold that volcanic energy
Yeah.
until it does dissipate.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I love that you say that it took decades. My husband and I were still working on it. We just went and worked with Harville Hendrix, who's one of
Mm,
all-time legends in the realms of conscious relationship. And they talk about having a safe word.
mhm.
So, when either of you are feeling hurt, you say the safe word, and that's sort of an invitation to take a breath and to take a moment to, be a little bit more mindful of what's coming up.
Mm,
But really what I see in this reactivity that you speak of, and what I see of it in myself, is that it really is just another form of anxiety. It's a fear that I don't want to feel, so I'm throwing it at him. So I'm afraid that he's going to abandon me, or I'm afraid that I look stupid because I messed up and I don't want to take ownership of that, or
yes.
afraid that he's not going to love me, or whatever the fear is. And so
Yeah.
then it comes out in this defensive way, which is just our ego going, oh, self-protect, self-protect.
Yes, yes, beautiful. Exactly. I love Harville Hendrix as well. By the way, we sat in a back of a limo together. We were on Oprah for my first time. Oh no, my third time I was on Oprah. We sat in that limo, and he was just such a delight.
It's so
Um, yeah, it's so wonderful. Um, yes, is another form of anxiety, and it's so good to name it for what and so much of what is anger is so often anxiety. Overwhelm is so often anxiety, right? These hundreds of manifestations of anxiety. And when we can dial it back in and say, I'm feeling really anxious, and going into that vulnerable place, which is so hard. It's just so hard to say, I'm scared you think I'm stupid, or whatever the fear is, whatever that moment of vulnerability. And Brené Brown, she just talks about it so well, and about her own marriage, and giving these examples of what it looks like to like drop all the defenses. It's just so hard to do.
it's so hard. And, most of us, like you say, most of us didn't have the experience of being allowed to have vulnerability because, of course, the generations before us actually didn't have these tools or resources at all.
They
And
didn't.
we really can't come at this from a place of judgment because it's just pure compassion and understanding. They didn't have safety.
Yep.
Abuse was just a commonplace thing in terms of how you treated children. And it was just okay to numb out, shut down, and to push through. And so, we're sort of coming from a new perspective here where it's for the first time in a long time safe as adults. It's safe for us as adults to learn how to come home to ourselves. And so that, of course, could be a lifelong journey.
Lifelong journey. And I see it as such a privilege and as part of our evolutionary growth as humans, that we are at this place in history where we have access to so many resources, sometimes too much, and it can be overwhelming, and we have to learn how to create boundaries over information overload, but that we are legions beyond the generations before us in terms of that emotional intelligence and awareness and our capacity to heal. So we are being asked through these messengers like anxiety, like relationship conflict, like these places of intense pain, are these doorways. There are these portals, right? And that's really the mindset shift, is to say, this is not here to torture us. Nobody has it easier. Whatever you see on Instagram and Facebook of the perfect relationship, it doesn't exist, right? We all struggle, right? And when you can really get behind that, it changes how we approach ourselves as humans, right? We're not then expected to be there, to be happy, to be normal. It's just being exactly where we are, right? And learning to meet all of these complicated, nuanced, mysterious, murky, vulnerable, beautiful places inside of us, right? From this mindset of, this is just what it is to be human. There's nothing actually wrong. It's just what it is to be human.
Full spectrum, light and dark. And one of my favorite books about writing, actually, by Stephen Herod Buhner. He's this
Mm,
magical man. He's written many books, mostly in the plant intelligence realm.
mm,
He's very connected to the plant medicine world, herbalism. He's a true legend, actually, in that field. And
mm.
he wrote a book on writing, and it's about the soul of writing. It's not about your traditional writing or following the rules. It's sort of anti that. It's called ensouling language. And he speaks in that book about how if a writer cannot fully embrace their capacity to love, but also to hate, then
Mhm.
they will never be a fully embodied writer,
Oh.
because it is in that full spectrum of allowing all of it that we are fully expressed and that the magic comes. And
Mhm.
I think sometimes in our culture we really struggle even just with that word hate, because
Yes,
it's
we
so
do.
strong. But we do have the capacity to hate, and it's very clear if you just turn on the news that there is the capacity for hate. And so, but it's the lack of ownership.
Because we all have it. It's not just on the news. I got chills when you said that, because we all have it. And I'll hear my clients say, but sometimes I hate my husband. I'm like, yeah, sometimes I hate my husband too. Like, I'm sure he hates me. Like, that's okay.
Mhm.
Right? And it's these cognitive distortions and expectations that then lead to anxiety, because if we think, uh-oh, that means, and it's our interpretation, if I feel hatred, that means I'm in the wrong relationship, or I'm a horrible human being, or whatever. Instead of, no, we are designed to feel, like the beautiful quote, right? This full spectrum, love to hate and everything in between.
And it's really in the owning of it. It's in the ownership of that, where we say, oh, I don't know how, I don't hate, other people hate, or I'm not angry, other people, the world is angry. And that's where we find ourselves having more anxiety, because our body is trying to process feelings that we've said are not okay.
Yes.
We've said,
Yeah.
nope, that's not okay. I'm not allowed to have that. And so the only other
Yes.
solution is for the body to almost dysregulate and go, but I am feeling that, but the conscious mind is saying, no, no, we're not allowed to do that.
Yes. And so then the body sort of traps around it, because where does that emotion go? It doesn't just disappear because you're telling yourself, I'm not supposed to feel that, right? It contracts, and it creates this, I don't know if we could actually see it, like this ball of energy around it, right? That's what, like, Michael Singer talks about emotions so beautifully in the Untethered Soul, around, if we want to get rid of feeling so much, then we have to actually feel it. You have to go into contracted spaces that we're trying so hard to push away.
Yeah, process the feelings and let them flow through rather than try to get rid of them, which usually looks like stuffing.
Yes.
And I love how you mentioned, I just want to go back to the piece around the therapy, because you mentioned, so you really suggest that people, find a supportive therapist who can hold space for them. And of course, we can have our partner play a role for us in our healing. and they can't be our primary space holder. So we don't want to get
Yeah.
into a dynamic with them. So it's
Right.
important to address that too, right? Is like, what are your expectations of your partner when you're feeling a lot? It's okay to ask for another support person who is neutral.
I mean, I think it's a marriage saver, honestly. I mean, if I had my way, everybody would have their own personal therapist, and then when needed, a couples therapist.
Mhm.
That this idea that we're meant to do this on our own is preposterous. We cannot do life on our own. Sure, we can have stretches of time and we're doing well and we take therapy breaks, but we are meant to have mentors and guides and therapists, which is a very particular experience to be sitting across from somebody who is tracking your psyche, somebody who is skilled, yes, who can hold space for deep emotion, which sadly a lot of therapists can't, because you can only go so far with somebody else as you've gone with your own emotional life. And it's not part of many therapy programs to do your own therapy, which I like can't even comprehend.
Okay.
Um, but there are a lot of therapists who um, are just up here. They've been trained in one model, which is usually CBT, which absolutely has its place, but it doesn't address the emotional realm.
Mhm.
And it doesn't really address the spiritual realm either. And so it's really great for addressing your cognitive distortions and for working with behavior and getting you to sort of run towards fear. And it's fantastic. And then there's this limitation. So when I'm suggesting that people go to therapy, I say go shopping. Don't be shy. You don't owe your new therapist anything by having one or two sessions. You can go until you find somebody who you feel so safe with, who you feel so seen by, who isn't afraid to go anywhere with you, who hopefully has some awareness of anxiety and how it shows up. I mean, for my clientele, it's probably different than yours. People usually find me through relationship anxiety, which is a very particular subset of people who go through perseverative doubt about a very loving, well-matched partner. And if they go to therapy and the therapist says, well, you sure you really want to be with this person because you're doubting? That's like, just a knife in
Yeah.
the heart. It is the last thing. And it just, of course, amplifies anxiety 1,000-fold. So to find somebody who gets the experience of anxiety, who understands that doubt does not necessarily mean don't, but that understands, has some model of for transitions and shadow work. And they are out there. There are some amazing therapists out there, and there are some really bad ones out there. And so to just shop until you find someone that is a match.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And I think that that's been one of the beautiful gifts in my alternative training. I didn't become a therapist. I worked with a spiritual teacher who sort of stemmed from the Osho Gurdjieff lineage.
Mm.
And it was sort of a blend of Jungian shadow work, Course in Miracles, Tantra, alchemy, all of the things.
Mm.
And for 4.5 years, we sat in group therapy chambers and we did, 4 to 8 hours a week of shadow work and our own inner work and really purifying ourselves and really being seen and really
Mhm.
burning away all of the protection that we had built in the masks, and really understanding, what are our defenses and what do they look like.
Mhm.
Be really self-accepting, and it's given me this gift to be with people in really dark places.
Mhm.
And Heather, who's my co-facilitator, that's one of her gifts, is really holding
Mhm.
space in just such a tender way. And,
Mhm.
it's so important. And I think one of the newest therapies that is sort of making its debut, it's not really that new, but it's new to all of us, really. It's becoming this really popular thing, is somatic experiencing,
Mhm.
where even though it's been around for a long time, all of a sudden it's kind of blowing up.
Mhm.
And it's really not a lot about talking. It's
Mhm.
really more about rewiring your nervous system, learning how to feel safe, and really tuning into the parts of your body that are storing trauma. And so and the therapist is supporting you in releasing it.
Yes.
And so I've been doing that for about 8 months every,
Mm.
and it's just been such a game changer for me.
Mm. Mm.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is, and it's interesting that it is exploding now. Peter Levine actually started his somatic experiencing here. It's in Boulder, and lived up in Lyons, which is 20 minutes from here, for years and years and years. So it's been around for a really, but the whole trauma world is really exploding, is what's happening. As we are, Bissell van der Kolk's work and the body remembers, like we are finally recognizing that trauma lives in the body and there are limitations to talk therapy. It's so important to tell your story. It's so important to be heard. So important to attend to those emotional realms. And then there is this piece that is so beyond words that the body is holding. And again, I think it's part of a global shift towards the embodied feminine, towards recognizing that our bodies have been steamrolled and raped and maligned. It's what's happening on our planet, and we're seeing it on the individual level and we're seeing it on the planetary level. That if we are going to evolve, which I believe we will, I think we already are, into our next great transition, it requires inhabiting these bodies and listening and revering these extraordinary bodies that we're in, that carry all of our wisdom and our portals to healing.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes. 100%. I love everything you just said, and I feel like that is the gold for us in this whole journey of healing, is really coming home to our bodies. We're just remembering. Yeah.
I agree.
So before we wrap up here, I want to show everybody your book again. So this is your book, Sheryl Paul, and we can find it on Amazon and
Amazon, Barnes and Noble. The publisher is Sounds True, so it's on their website as well. It's an independent booksellers as well, if that's your preference.
Okay. And so before we wrap up, I'm curious if you have anything else that we didn't talk about that you feel like you would like to share.
I don't think so. I think we covered quite a broad spectrum of topics.
We did.
Yes.
This was wonderful. Thanks for taking the time to share. For those who want to learn more about Sheryl, where can they find you?
So my website is conscious-transitions.com. Actually have a couple of live in-person retreats coming up, which I'm excited about. One is in April at 1440 Multiversity, which is in California. And the other is in July at the Art of Living Retreat Center, which is in North Carolina.
That's where Harville Hendrix does a lot of his retreats as well.
At Art of Living or 1440?
Both of them, actually. So maybe I should just come to both. That sounds amazing. That'll be really beautiful. What are your retreats like?
So it'll be very experiential, diving into the principles in the book, but an embodied experience of not going to be sitting there talking at you. We are going to be working with a lot of the visualizations that I teach and that I lead, of coming into our bodies and letting them guide us and into the land itself. Both of these are in beautiful locations. And both of the retreat structures allow for plenty of time to also experience the retreat center, the redwoods near Santa Cruz, and the mountains in North Carolina. Both have really amazing food and water, and so it's a holistic experience of learning about really what it means to harvest the gems that anxiety is presenting to us.
Gorgeous. Okay, and so they can find that on your website. And then you also have Instagram, which is at Wisdom of Anxiety.
Yes.
Yep.
Correct. And I have many, many online courses as well, which is mostly how people receive support from me. Is I have courses on relationship anxiety. I have a course on love and attraction, open your heart. I have a course on self-trust, trust yourself. Courses on the wedding transition. All of my initial work was on transition. So transition of getting married and the transition of becoming a mother. So those are all on my site as well.
Okay, so I will link to all of that for you guys watching on the notes just below. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Being in touch with you.
Yeah, so good. Thank you so much.